12-person jury had deliberated over about 10 hours in the span of 2 days. At one point asked the judge to reread his instructions. They wanted to have a readback of some of the testimony. And then all of a sudden we heard that they had reached a verdict, and they were brought into the courtroom, and there was obviously quite a hush. And then one after another, guilty, 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 34 counts, as Donald Trump sat there motionless, hearing the jury's verdict against him.
Tell us more about the reaction. I understand the judge was very grateful to the jury because he knew they had such an enormous task. What did he have to say?
Yeah, it's a standard message that we hear from judges in the United States to the jury, thanking them for their service, acknowledging the hardship that it had caused. But of course, in this case, there was a lot of speculation that somehow these jurors might be intimidated or targeted. Donald Trump was under a partial gag order. He was allowed to make comments about the judge, but not the judge's family or the jury. And that gag order, we expect maybe lifted now. And Donald Trump on Friday morning here at Trump Tower, New York City, is expected to elaborate with reporters more about his thoughts as to what happened and where he goes from here.
Well, tell us a little bit more about his reaction. You said that he remained very still and unresponsive. What do you think was going through his mind at the time that the 34 guilty verdicts were read out?
Well, I think like a lot of other people in the courtroom, he was shocked. There had been an expectation, perhaps, that there might be one or more jurors that would hold out against conviction. Perhaps that because of technicalities in the minds of the jurors, that all 34 counts would not go against Donald Trump. So he was obviously very surprised. He came out of the courtroom, spoke briefly, about 3 minutes to reporters. He was much more subdued than he usually is. And, of course, reiterated the lines he has said throughout this, which is that, with no evidence, that this was politically motivated by the Joe Biden administration. This case actually predates Biden getting into the presidency. He called the judge corrupt, says obviously there's going to be an appeal, and I expect he'll elaborate and be more nuanced about that later in the day.
And I think we were all surprised how quickly the jury were able to reach a unanimous decision. What does it say about the evidence that was presented throughout the trial? Because from outside court, there have been a lot of distractions and claims from Trump's team, but the jury really had to remain focused on what was presented to them in court, and that only.
Well, there's a lot of legal analysis going on about this, Yvonne, as you might imagine. And there are some observations sort of across the board on this. One is that the prosecution basically had bumped this up from misdemeanor charges to what's called a Class E felony in the state of New York, the lowest level felony. And they only had one particular incriminating witness, Michael Cohen, former lawyer for Donald Trump, who was obviously someone who was convicted of his own charges for lying about a lot of things that happened around this. So a lot of people thought, well, this is a pretty weak case for the prosecution. And there are also commentaries now that, well, Donald Trump perhaps didn't have the best lawyers on his side, and that the defense really did not put on a good case. And whether there's anything from the judge's instructions or the procedures in this case that might give Donald Trump some legal ground to stand on in an appeal remains to be seen. But it usually in New York State, what the jury's verdict does withhold, is upheld on appeal there. So there's no expectation that really that this is going to be overturned. It's just a matter of timing. Sentencing set for July 11th.
So how might that appeal affect the sentencing and the whole timeline of it all? And do you think we will see Donald Trump finally sentenced to prison? Many observers say it's unlikely.
Yes, although on social media you'll see a lot of Trump's opponents saying they hope and expect he will go to jail. But let's look at the facts here. It's a first-time conviction. He's a rather older male with, this was a nonviolent crime. someone very prominent in the community, obviously. Maximum 4 years sentence in prison on each of these counts. So maximum they would probably be all set to run concurrently. So worst case scenario for Donald Trump, 4 years in prison. Best case scenario is probation, but that comes with some restrictions as well.
And how will this all impact Donald Trump's ability to campaign for the presidential election, given that the Republican convention is just around the corner?
Right. Those of us who are going to be covering that convention on site expect that Donald Trump and others who are speaking there will use this to paint the former president as some type of martyr and push this narrative that this is all politically motivated. So does this help or hurt Trump in the long run in the general election? There's less than 1 in 5 voters said previously that a conviction would affect their vote, Biden versus Trump. But in an election that's going to be very, very close, something like this could help determine whether Donald Trump wins or loses.
And just finally, Steve, all eyes have been on this case because it's the only one of the 4 criminal cases he faces that will likely see an outcome before the November election. Even if he is a convicted felon, sentenced to jail, if he is or not, he can still run for president, so he's still going to go for the White House.
Correct, Yvonne. There's no restriction on a convicted felon running for president. It happened with the Socialist Party candidate Eugene V. Debs in 1920. He got 1 million votes. Wasn't enough to win the election. It was about 4% of the electorate. We're in uncharted territory here because every news story from the mainstream media and, of course, the left of center press will label Donald Trump a convicted felon now.
Steve Herman, great to get your analysis. Thanks so much for your time, as always.
My pleasure.